I pulled into my own driveway a little after 10 at night, 4 days ahead of schedule after a client project wrapped up early. And the first thing I noticed was that the porch light I always leave on was off, replaced by a string of decorative lanterns I'd never bought hanging along the entryway. The second thing I noticed, once I got my key into the front door and stepped inside, was a woman standing in my kitchen in a bathrobe, holding a glass of my wine, looking at me like I was the one who'd broken into somewhere I didn't belong. My name is Preston Whitlock. I'm 46 years old, and I work as an independent structural engineering consultant, which means I spend a good 6 or 7 months out of any given year traveling to job sites scattered across the country, sometimes gone for 3 or 4 weeks at a stretch without coming home even once. I bought my house, a large 6-bedroom place at the end of a cul-de-sac in a gated community called Marbrook Heights, about 5 years ago, specifically because the neighborhood's tight security and low turnover meant I could travel for work without worrying much about the place sitting empty. I want to be clear about something right up front, because it matters a great deal to how the rest of this story unfolds. I had been gone exactly 19 days on that particular trip, working a bridge inspection contract 3 states away, and I had told absolutely nobody, not a single soul in Marbrook Heights, that I'd be returning early. As far as anyone in that neighborhood should have known, I wasn't due back for another 4 days. The woman standing in my kitchen, it turned out, was Deandra Wexler, president of the Marbrook Heights Homeowners Association, and according to what I eventually pieced together, she had been living in my house for the better part of 3 weeks. I want to back up and explain how something this strange could possibly happen, because it took me a good long while myself to fully understand it, standing there in my own front hallway at 10 o'clock at night trying to process what I was looking at. Deandra had been president of the Marbrook Heights Association for going on 5 years, roughly the same length of time I'd owned my house, and in all that time, our interactions had never amounted to much more than the occasional pleasant nod at community events I rarely had time to attend. I paid my dues on time, kept my lawn maintained through a landscaping service I'd hired specifically because of my travel schedule, and otherwise stayed about as invisible a homeowner as Marbrook Heights had. That invisibility, as it turned out, was exactly the problem. About 3 weeks before I came home early, a pipe had burst in the guest bathroom on the 2nd floor of my house, something I only learned about after the fact through the water damage restoration invoice that eventually crossed my desk. My landscaping service, arriving for their regular bi-weekly visit, had noticed water pooling near the foundation, and following the emergency contact protocol I'd set up specifically for situations like this, had called the property management contact listed for Marbrook Heights, which happened to route directly to Deandra's own cell phone, since she'd apparently taken over that responsibility personally the previous year, when the association let go of their outside management company to save on dues. Deandra had entered my house that day using an association master key, a practice I later learned was technically outlined in an obscure emergency access provision buried deep in the community bylaws, intended for exactly this kind of situation. A genuine emergency where a homeowner couldn't be reached, and immediate action was needed to prevent further damage. What was supposed to happen, according to those same bylaws, was a call to a licensed plumber, temporary mitigation of the water damage, and a formal notice left for the homeowner detailing exactly what had occurred and what access had been used. What actually happened, based on everything I eventually reconstructed, was considerably different. I called an attorney within the first 48 hours after that night in my kitchen, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ophelia Grantham who'd handled property and homeowner association disputes for the better part of 2 decades in that county. I laid out everything I knew at that point, which admittedly wasn't much beyond the bewildering fact that I'd found the association president living in my house. "Before we go any further," Ophelia told me, "I want you to understand something important. Whatever access she may have technically had for an emergency, staying in your home for 3 weeks afterward is an entirely separate matter, and nothing in any homeowners association bylaws I've ever reviewed would authorize that. I explained what had happened that night itself, because the details mattered enormously to everything that came after. Standing in my kitchen that night, staring at a stranger in a bathrobe holding my wine glass, my first reaction wasn't anger. It was pure, bewildered confusion, the kind that makes you genuinely question whether you've somehow walked into the wrong house. Deendra's reaction, once she processed that I wasn't supposed to be there, was something else entirely. She set the wine glass down, straightened up, and asked me with a tone that suggested I was the one behaving inappropriately what exactly I thought I was doing in her house. "This is my house," I said. "I've owned it for 5 years. I think the better question is what you're doing in it." She seemed to recalibrate for a second, and then launched into an explanation about the burst pipe, the emergency access, and how, given that I'd apparently been unreachable for weeks, and the water damage had been severe enough to require, in her words, ongoing supervision of the restoration process, she'd made the reasonable decision to stay on site temporarily to oversee the repairs and prevent any further damage from occurring while contractors worked. I want to note that not one of those explanations addressed why she was standing in my kitchen in a bathrobe drinking my wine at 10 o'clock at night, nor why, when I glanced around, I could see clothes that clearly weren't mine hanging in my front hall closet, or why there was a stack of mail on my counter addressed to her at this address, which told me she'd apparently redirected at least some of her own correspondence here during whatever period she'd decided this had become her temporary residence. Before I could ask any further questions, Deendra pulled out her phone and called the police, informing the dispatcher, loudly enough that I heard every word, that an unknown man had broken into a residence she was currently overseeing, refusing to leave despite her instructions. The 2 officers who arrived about 15 minutes later handled the situation with considerably more patience than I probably would have managed in their position, walking into a scene where 2 adults were each insisting, with apparent sincerity, that the other one was the intruder. I want to give credit where it's due. The lead officer, a calm, methodical woman named Sergeant Alvarez, asked for identification from both of us before anything else, and then asked a simple, direct question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Sir, do you have anything showing you own this property?" I handed over my driver's license, which listed this exact address, along with a mortgage statement I happened to have in my travel bag from the trip, since I'd been dealing with a refinancing question with my bank earlier that same week, and had the document handy purely by coincidence. Sergeant Alvarez reviewed both carefully, then turned to Deendra. "Ma'am, can you provide documentation showing your legal right to occupy this residence?" Deendra's explanation, delivered considerably less confidently than her initial 911 call had suggested, described the burst pipe, the emergency access provision in the association bylaws, and her role overseeing the restoration work. Sergeant Alvarez listened patiently, then asked the question that seemed to genuinely catch Deendra off guard. "And that emergency access authorized you to personally reside here for 3 weeks?" Deendra didn't have a clean answer to that question, not one that held up under even the mild scrutiny of a police officer standing in a stranger's kitchen at 10:30 at night. Sergeant Alvarez, after conferring briefly with her partner, informed Deendra that since I could establish clear ownership of the property, and she could not establish any legal right to continue occupying it, she would need to gather her belongings and leave that same evening. I want to explain what I learned over the following weeks, because the burst pipe and the 3 weeks of unauthorized residence turned out to be only the surface of something considerably larger. The same way Deendra's calm explanation that night turned out to be only the surface of a story she'd clearly been rehearsing in case anyone ever asked. Ophelia, working alongside a private investigator she regularly retained for exactly this kind of situation, began piecing together a timeline of Deendra's actual activities during the 3 weeks she'd occupied my house. And what emerged was considerably stranger than a simple case of an HOA president overstaying an emergency repair visit. Deendra, it turned out, had been going through what a mutual acquaintance later described to me carefully and somewhat reluctantly, as a difficult separation from her husband, one that had apparently left her needing to vacate their shared home on short notice while the divorce proceedings sorted out who would keep the property. Rather than staying with family or securing a short-term rental, she had, according to the timeline Ophelia's investigator assembled, used her position and her access to the emergency master key system to quietly relocate into my house, calculating, correctly as it turned out for nearly 3 weeks, that I traveled frequently enough and communicated little enough with the neighborhood that my absence would go unnoticed for an extended period. The redirected mail wasn't an isolated oversight either. Ophelia's investigator found that Deendra had filed a temporary change of address with the Postal Service listing my address, and had informed at least 2 close friends that she was, quote, staying at a property she managed for a while during the separation. Language vague enough to sound plausible without ever specifying that the property in question belonged to someone else entirely. The part of this story that genuinely surprised me, once it came fully into focus, was learning that I wasn't the only homeowner in Marbrook Heights this had happened to. Ophelia's investigator, digging into Deendra's use of the master key system over her 5 years as association president, found records suggesting at least 2 other instances of extended, unauthorized access to homes belonging to residents who traveled frequently or maintained vacation properties they visited only occasionally. One of those homeowners, a retired airline pilot named Corbin Ashwood, who split his time between Marbrook Heights and a second property out of state, confirmed to Ophelia's investigator that he'd once returned to find several personal items rearranged, and a faint but distinct impression that someone had been using his home office during an extended absence, though he'd never been able to prove anything definitively at the time, and had eventually written it off as his own imagination or perhaps a cleaning service he'd forgotten he'd hired. Once Corbin heard about what had happened to me, his account of that earlier, unexplained experience suddenly made a great deal more sense to him, and he agreed to formally document what he remembered for Ophelia's file, adding a second data point to what was beginning to look less like an isolated lapse in judgment, and more like an established pattern Deendra had quietly relied on whenever her own circumstances required it. I filed a formal complaint with the Marbrook Heights board within the week, requesting a full accounting of the association's master key access log, along with a review of the emergency access provision that Deendra had apparently interpreted so liberally. The board, to their credit, moved considerably faster than I expected once the situation became clear, calling an emergency session within days rather than waiting for the next regularly scheduled meeting. I attended that session alongside Ophelia, and Corbin Ashwood came as well, having decided that his own earlier suspicions deserved a proper airing now that a second, far more concrete incident had brought the whole pattern into the light. Deendra attempted to open the meeting by characterizing the situation as an unfortunate personal circumstance that had led to a lapse in judgment during an extremely difficult period in her life. Language calculated, I suspect, to generate sympathy from a board that had known her for years and genuinely liked her in most other respects. A board member named Percival Nkemdiram, who'd served alongside Deendra for 3 years and had, by his own later admission, always found her competent and reasonable in her handling of association business, asked the question that seemed to finally shift the room's understanding of the situation. "Deendra," he said, "did you file a change of address with the post office listing Mr. Whitlock's home as your residence?" The silence that followed answered the question more clearly than anything Deendra could have said aloud. When she finally did answer, admitting that she had, the room's mood shifted from sympathetic discomfort to something considerably colder, because a change of address filing wasn't the kind of thing that happened accidentally during a moment of personal crisis. It was a deliberate, planned action, taken with the clear intention of settling into someone else's home for an extended, indefinite period. Corbin then described his own earlier experience, the rearranged items, The faint sense that his home office had been used during an absence he'd never fully explained to his own satisfaction at the time, combined with the documented 3 weeks in my house and the change of address filing. The pattern that emerged was no longer something anyone in that room could reasonably characterize as a single unfortunate lapse. The board voted that same night to remove Deendra from her position immediately, and to revoke her personal access to the association's master key system entirely, replacing it with a considerably stricter protocol requiring 2 board members to jointly authorize any emergency entry going forward, along with mandatory documentation logged within 24 hours of any such access occurring. Percival Nkemdiram stepped in as interim president, and one of his first actions was commissioning a full audit of every master key entry logged over the previous 5 years, cross-referencing each one against actual documented emergencies to ensure nothing similar had gone unnoticed among the community's other frequently traveling homeowners. I want to be fair to Deendra in one narrow respect. I don't believe she set out from the very beginning with some grand scheme to repeatedly exploit her position for personal housing whenever her life grew difficult. I think, much like plenty of people who slowly drift into behavior they'd never have countenanced at the outset, a single genuine emergency access, during what was clearly a difficult and destabilizing period in her personal life, gradually stretched into something she convinced herself was harmless, temporary, and unlikely to ever be discovered, precisely because the homeowners she chose, myself and apparently Corbin before me, traveled frequently enough that the odds of an unexpected early return seemed genuinely low. Those odds, as it turned out, weren't quite as favorable as she'd calculated, given that a client project wrapping up 4 days ahead of schedule was all it ultimately took to bring the entire situation into the light. I had the locks changed the following morning, obviously, along with the emergency access code for the master key box that Marbrook Heights maintained for genuine emergencies going forward. This time with a proper written protocol, I insisted on personally reviewing before agreeing to remain part of that system at all. Corbin did the same at his own property, and I understand from Percival that several other frequently traveling homeowners in the community followed suit shortly after word of the situation spread, understandably unwilling to take the same risk twice now that everyone understood exactly how loosely that emergency provision had once been interpreted. I don't know exactly what happened to Deendra after she left Marbrook Heights that night, gathering her things into a single suitcase while Sergeant Alvarez stood by. And I'll admit I've thought about her circumstances more than once since then with a complicated mixture of frustration and a small measure of genuine sympathy, given the difficult personal situation that apparently set the whole thing in motion. But sympathy for someone's circumstances has never struck me as a reasonable substitute for simply asking, honestly and directly, for help when you need it, rather than quietly deciding that someone else's empty house has become yours to occupy because the odds of getting caught seemed comfortably low. I still travel just as much for work as I ever did, maybe more now, and my house sits empty for weeks at a stretch the same way it always has. But there's a peace of mind now, knowing exactly who has access to that front door and under exactly what conditions, that I genuinely didn't have before that strange, unsettling night I walked into my own kitchen and found somebody else's wine glass sitting on my counter. If this story hit home for you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because there are plenty more stories just like this one still to come. Drop a comment down below and let me know what you thought of this one, or whether you've ever come home to find something in your own house that didn't quite add up. I read every single comment, and honestly, some of the best stories on this channel started as a comment somebody left on a video just like this.